Hi guys, welcome back to another video, or your first video here, I don't know. Welcome if you're new here, welcome either way. So today I'm going through my November wrap up, part 2. The next is another book that I don't have and it's called Haven. I really can't explain much of the plot to you apart from it follows a character who is queer, and a lot of the story is very much told in, what's the word I'm looking for? Lyrical isn't quite the right word I'm looking for. It's kind of like, it's not poetry, but it's very poetic. Metaphorical, that's it. So it's very, very metaphorical. Sometimes this works in books, sometimes it doesn't. I think something that really helped me with the reading of this was the fact that there was an audiobook, and it helped me understand, like, it kept up the pace and you hear it in the cadence that the author clearly wanted it to be understood in. The thing is that after reading it, it hasn't stuck in my mind super well. It was a very enjoyable read at the time, but I don't see it being a favourite book of all time. Next we have Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. I really want to, or I have wanted to and continue to want to make a conscious effort to get some of the series on my shelves read. So this is the first book in the Grisha Trilogy, and it was a very enjoyable read. It's a young adult trilogy about two best friends who have no magic of their own. You have the Grisha, who are these magical beings in their world. So the humans, in a way, are treated almost as second-class citizens. Both of them have decided to join the army. So Alina, the main character, then is discovered to have magical abilities and gets brought into this world, and you follow how she navigates that while also trying to keep hold of the friendship that she treasures. So this is one of the very few cases where I was actually okay with a love triangle, the love triangle situation. I obviously don't want to spoil how that goes down, but it wasn't the girl is loved by two guys and one of them is her childhood best friend that she doesn't know has feelings for her. The other one is this mysterious new character who she prefers. And then, like, it didn't go down quite that route. And so I liked the way that that developed. I liked the introduction to the world. It wasn't, oh my god, amazing, this is the best thing ever. So I'm debating whether or not to spoil myself for the other two books in the series and then continue in the expanded universe, the other books that the author has written in this world. Let me know if they're worth reading or whether or not I should just skip them and continue on. But this was enjoyable. Next, I have another comic, and that is Woman World, essentially about a near future world where all the men have gone extinct, and then it's a series of comics following some recurring characters, although most of the comics are sort of distinct narratives. And I just thought it was a really interesting look at what the world might look like if suddenly all the men disappeared, and I thought it was really cool. Next, I have an Agatha Christie called Taken at the Flood. So this follows a inheritance story, and we follow one woman who is suddenly becomes in the possession of her dead husband's fortune, and she is sort of wanted dead, or wanted dead faster than she might otherwise, by his other family members who have now been cheated out of their inheritance. So Poirot gets involved to solve the mystery, and I thought it was a really solid Poirot novel. I always miss the absence of Hastings. I really like their dynamic in a lot of these stories. So we have a character who plays off Poirot in here and gets told a lot of his ideas, but I thought it was really good regardless. Next, a book that I reread is Stealing the Wind, the first book in the Mermen of E series by Shira Anthony. So this is a gay merman story about a young boy called Taran, and he gets sold into slavery at a very young age, and he then gets kidnapped by pirates, and like there's a lot that happens once on this pirate ship, and once he's really integrated himself and really felt like he's found his people and his family, the ship then gets hit by a storm. He dives overboard to save another one of the people, and he is then found by another ship, and he has to navigate that situation. So I thought this was really good. I really enjoyed it the first time. I really enjoyed it the second. I think it doesn't shy away from tackling some more serious topics. However, something that I didn't like about this, but I feel like I've been spoiled by like really good audiobooks recently. It's the first time in a while that I've read an audiobook that I didn't think was done very well. So essentially, I mean, when things aren't that bad, I think that the narrator does a fine job of narrating things, but as soon as the characters need to yell or shout, or they're angry or in pain, or anything is going on that's more than just a sort of neutral-ish moment or a happy moment, I just never felt it. It was like, oh my god, how could this happen? And I was like, oh, for goodness sake. So it did not trivialize, maybe trivialized a couple of the more intense moments, and so I do think I'm going to be continuing in this series, just reading it physically, but this was still an enjoyable reread. Next we have an Audible original, so a very short book called M2WTF. I like the fact that Audible is giving a platform to more marginalised communities to tell their stories. I also feel like, I hope that these platforms continue to give a platform for people to tell fiction, not just recount hardship. But this was a really enjoyable read by this trans woman who was essentially recounting her story, and I found it really interesting. Next we have another Agatha Christie, and that is Crooked House. So this was another enjoyable read, but not that I went into it with the wrong expectations, but I thought this was a Poirot novel, so I was getting really confused and kept on waiting for Poirot to show up, and I didn't realise that he just never was going to. So it follows two people who over the war struck up a relationship and a romance, and then they come back from the war and things have really changed back home, and it's a lot of questioning as to whether or not the other person is who they said they were or reliable. A lot of weird things start going on in the house, and then there's a murder. So my Fitbit is telling me something, sorry. But yes, I found this a really interesting read, and yet again, I didn't predict how it was going to end. I thought it was really good. Next we have Sweet Treats, which is another Rocky Flintstone Belinda Blinked book, but it's a recipe book. I mean, the reason why it's here is because the way that it's been released is that there are recipes interspliced between interactions between the characters from the series. So obviously I gave the series all 1 star each, but I thought that it was fairly well done in terms of the recipes. Actually, I think that the interactions between the characters were the weakest points of it, hence why I got a 4 and not a 5. But yeah, that's why I have a recipe book on here. And finally, for 4 stars, we have The Enchanter. So this is a gay fantasy, what I've now found out is a series. I thought originally it was a standalone, but it's about a boy who, well, not boy, a man who, that makes it sound like he's older. Anyway, a young person, someone in their late teens, who always thought that they would grow up to be they grew up as a tailor's apprentice, and they always thought that they would take over the shop one day and that would be their destiny. But he then finds out that he has magical abilities and gets sent to magic school. But a lot of this book is commentary on wealth and power, and how having wealth automatically sets someone up for success, and how some people are always going to be at a disadvantage, even if they are incredibly smart, incredibly hardworking, etc. So I really loved the relationships and the friendships that he built over this story. There were some really infuriating decisions he makes, but then again, he was a young person and it made sense for the character with the decisions he was making. And I think that it took a couple of times for him to like learn his lesson, but I did really enjoy it. I will continue on with the series. And finally, we are on to 5 stars. So I read this month The Lick of Love by Julian Clary, How Dogs Changed My Life. So I really enjoy Julian Clary's comedy. I always love watching them when they do the panto at the Palladium every year, and this was just really lovely. It was equal amount stories from his life and how that has sort of coincided with the dogs that he's had over his life, and he talks about the impact that each of his dogs has had on him, and I just thought it was a really wonderfully told book. So I would highly recommend it if you like dogs and or Julian Clary. The next 5-star I have is the transgender issue. So this book I found really interesting as it's taken the phrase the transgender issue, which a lot of people have used to be the issue of trans people's existence, and turned it into what issues are faced by trans people. And you know, if we keep on having the same argument about the existence of trans people or what bathrooms should trans people use, then we're not actually getting to any of the problems faced by people and the discrimination that we have to really change as a society. So I thought this was such an excellent non-fiction in terms of going through what laws, especially in the UK, what laws we currently have, how they really do not serve the whole population, and how in order to move forward as a country, it needs to take care of all of its citizens. And I just thought this was a really, really powerful read, and I highly recommend. Oh, the next one's a fun one. So next we have The Henchman of Zenda, another queer, I mean, I would class this as a romance, but it's more sort of swashbuckling adventure kind of. Now, I didn't know that this was originally based on another book. People say it's a classic. I had never actually heard of it, but my dad had, so fair enough. And that is I can't remember, The Prisoner of Zenda. And I think that finding that out increased my enjoyment of it, but I loved it regardless of not knowing that. So the book follows one of the henchmen who is mentioned very much in passing in The Prisoner of Zenda, and tells the story of that book from his perspective. But in this world, The Prisoner of Zenda, the book, is something that has been released in that world, and he's like, this is how this was written in order to make this character seem like a complete hero, but actually he was an arse, or this is how this really happened, and like there were certain references to the book. And it follows a guy who gets hired as a henchman for a man. He is essentially tasked with doing his bidding, but also keeping an eye on the other henchmen, especially one called... No, it's either Rupert or something along those lines, because there are 2 characters with very similar names, but they start to form a relationship, even though that they don't know whether or not they can trust each other. And I just loved their dynamic, their witty back and forth. I loved their sort of skirting around each other, and it was just a really, really fun read, highly action-packed, and also highly heartfelt. I just really loved it. Next, I have finally finished the Lunar Chronicles series by Marissa Meyer. I haven't read any of the sort of extra bits that have now been added to the story. I know there's a book out called Stars Above, and I know that there's a book called Fairest. I don't know. One of those is like a collection of short stories in this world, but I really loved this series from start to finish. I can totally understand why this is a young adult series that has just kept in the zeitgeist. It keeps on being released. I see it every time I'm at the bookshop, and this was just an excellent conclusion to the story. It is a near future sci-fi retelling of a bunch of fairy tales. The first one being Cinderella, this one focusing more on Snow White. I can't get rid of this sticker or it will peel up pieces of the cover, which is very annoying, but I loved how each of the books in the series build on what's been already established, and the clever references to the original fairy tales, even when the plot of the novels has gone so far beyond that premise. And I can't really tell you much about this one without obviously spoiling the rest of the series, but the first book follows a half girl, half cyborg called Cinder and her stepmother and stepsisters, and from there it goes very, not off the rails, but very different from the original Cinderella retelling. But I thought that this series has such an interesting commentary on citizens that are seen as less than, racial commentary, and I just thought this was excellent. My favourite characters still remain Scar and Wolf, which is the retelling part of the Little Red Riding Hood, and I loved how those characters evolved in here. I really think that this author does not shy away from terrible things happening to these characters and these characters being put in no-win situation after another, and I really loved it, and I can definitely see why it has stood the test of time. Also, this is a chunky monkey. I'm really glad I got this finished. I think this might have been the longest book that I read in 2022. I think so. Next we have I Hate Fairyland. So I'm pretty sure that I read volume 1 the previous month. Yeah, so this was I Hate Fairyland volume 2. I thought this was even better than the first. I absolutely loved it. I love the premise. It's about a girl who, as a very young child, she is dropped into fairyland and she doesn't want to be there, essentially. And in this world, children are let into fairyland. They have a wonderful adventure for a day, maximum a couple of days, where they have to walk through fairyland and get helped by all these magical creatures, and they eventually find their key and they get to the door so they can leave fairyland and go back without having really gone at all. And they've had a wonderful childhood adventure. The main character, Gertrude, fell into fairyland at the age of like 8 or 9-ish and has now been there for over 30 years and has never managed to find her key, and she has just turned horrendously murderous. She's gotten more, so she's not been able to age. Her body hasn't changed at all while being in fairyland, but she's just become such a resigned, angry character and is just on a murder rampage through fairyland. And I thought this was an excellent continuation in the series. I think that, not the issues I had, but why I didn't give the first one a full 5-star is that there were certain elements of the world building that were very well explained, and others I needed more from, especially in terms of whether or not a character can die in fairyland, or whether or not they can regenerate, and whether or not that changes depending on if you're a resident of fairyland compared to being one of the children who is brought into fairyland. So that didn't get explained fully to my satisfaction, but despite that, I think it worked because there wasn't such a focus on rules and worlding, but the first book has such a focus on rules and law, and these are the things that the residents of fairyland are and are not allowed to do in what circumstances. So it stood out that bit of world building wasn't quite there, whereas in this there was less of that, so it bothered me less, I guess. I'm sure by the end of the series I will find out more. And also I just found out that the author is coming out with another installment in the series. Like, we all thought that it was done at volume 4, but I have seen that a volume 5 is coming out. Very, very excited for that. So now we have 2 books in a series, and I just fell in love with these. I read both of them over the course of an evening each. They were just so impulsively? Anyway, they were so readable. So we have the first one being Lord of Eternal Night, which I'll go through first. This one follows a curse where a village have to release a person to be essentially a sacrifice to a demon living in a castle each year, and the main character Jack is that sacrifice this year, and he has been trained his whole life in order to kill the demon and thereby ending the curse. And it's about him and his experiences in the castle and how things develop as he meets this person or demon. And I just loved the magic system, I loved the dark vibes, I loved the ways in which the two characters started learning things about each other. I think also just learning how to love, but I also think it had an incredibly interesting take on the idea of revenge. A lot of books I read have revenge as something either be done by an incredibly bad character and therefore is not seen as a good thing, or it is very frowned upon when thought of by good characters. But this was very much in the middle. These characters were neither good nor bad. The things they do, like, they didn't do only good things or only bad things, and you could see them under both good and bad lights, and I just really loved that about it. And the second book, which is set in the same world but following completely different characters, or it follows the same world but after years have passed, which is King of the Immortal Tithe. So this follows a city which is surrounded by a huge wall to keep the inhabitants safe from the demons outside of their borders. But in order to be kept safe, there are elven royalty that visit every year, and each year they take a bride or a husband from the human community that is living there, and we follow one character who hates the situation they're put in and frequently has to venture beyond the wall to keep himself alive, and who gets inadvertently chosen by one of the elves and so has to negotiate that situation. So I just thought that the commentary in here about power dynamics and about consent and about really living if you're being kept in a cage essentially, and how how people who are trapped can come to love the situation they're in or like the situation they are forced to be in. And I just thought that was such an interesting thing. I loved how it crossed over slightly with the events of the first novel, and I really can't wait to see how the series continues. There are certain characters who I can see how there could be books based on those characters moving forward. And again, I just love the not immorality, but the grey morality of these characters, and how they are not just governed by I have to be a good person. It's I need to do the things that need doing. I've been talking for a long time. Anyway, the next book I have is I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. So this book has been getting so much praise this year, and for really good reason. So Jeanette played Sam in iCarly, which is was a very big part of my generation's childhood watching of TV. And in this memoir, she really goes into both her relationship with her mother and her relationship with acting and with the show. And it's really heartbreaking how a lot of these shows that mean so much to my generation especially were produced and made by these people who were so horrible and disgusting, and how even in ways in which those people were punished by the system, it really just punished the rest of the actors. It didn't really impact those people doing the bad things. I just thought that was really disgusting. Her mother was such a horrid, horrid human being. I can see why Jeanette decided to make this the title. A lot of people, I think, who haven't read it are very much like, oh, that's not clickbait, and that's not the word I'm looking for, that's a video, but saying that she's just using the shocking cover in order to get people to pick up her book, and I completely disagree. I think that the title is warranted with the journey that she goes on and how cleverly she goes through the events, where she goes through them linearly, so she's not looking back the whole time, she's in the head of herself at each of the ages. I'm not explaining that very well, but by the end, I mean, I'm glad her mum died. It, like, she was such an awful person to her and to her family, and I just thought it was really disgusting the way that this woman treated her. So I just thought this was such an excellent book, and I highly recommend. And finally, good lord, I've been filming for over an hour now. Finally, we have my favourite book of the month, and that is The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. This is so fantastic. This is a mystery novel where the main character wakes up at the beginning of the day. He has no memories of who he is, where he is, why he's there. He's outside looking for someone. He doesn't know who that someone is. And he has to go through his day just trying to piece things together and work out what's going on. And at the end of the day, someone dies. So he gets to this point where that person dies, and he then wakes up the next morning, but he's reliving the same day and in the body of another guest. So he has to solve the mystery before he runs out of hosts and before other people who are trying to kill him find him and get him. So this was such a fantastic story. I have read a couple of books in the reliving the same day over and over again, and I really love that trope when it's done well. This has been the first one where the events of one day can influence the next one, and I thought this just added such a level of complexity to the story. It was so interesting how he was affected by being in the heads of the different hosts over the course of the repeated days, and it's just such an excellent mystery. I did not predict the ending. I had a couple of theories running through it, and none of them turned out to be true, but I really, really loved it, and I think this is a book that 100% deserves the hype that it gets. It's excellent. So time for a thumbnail. And there we go. So there we have it. These are just a selection of the books I read over the month of November. And yeah, I think I had an excellent reading month. I really enjoyed a lot of these. And I will now get on and film probably my December wrap up. But yeah, I will see you in another video very soon. Bye.